Hi, everybody, and thank you for the invitation. My name is Leila Wehbe. I'm a professor at the Machine Learning Department at Neuroscience Institute at Carnegie Mellon University. And I'm going to tell you today about using large language models and medium language models as well to study how the brain represents complex meaning, specifically during language processing. And what I'm interested in at the high level is to understand more about the algorithms that the brain uses to understand individual words and combine them together to make sense of the meaning of sentences. And the problem is that, unfortunately, given we're still quite far from such an algorithmic understanding of really what are, like, how is our words broken down into individual units of meaning and how are they combined, and like what is going on. And so there's been obviously a lot of research in the field, and there's been multiple conceptual models of language processing that have been proposed by multiple people that have become very influential. But unfortunately, these models don't really agree with each other. So while they're concerned, they're focused around the same regions, more or less. So regions in the left temporal and left inferior frontal gyrus, they don't really ascribe the same function to the same region. And I think one of the problems for that, or one of the reasons for this problem, is that these kinds of models are based on individual studies that only focus on one part of language at a time. So for example, they just study syntax and fix everything else and just vary syntax. And it's unclear that by doing these kinds of kind of surgical manipulations, you can get at a global understanding of how the whole system works together. So an alternative way for investigating language is an approach that's been gaining traction lately, which is to use naturalistic experiments. So in this case, people are sitting in the scanner and doing a complex task, like reading an entire chapter of a book, and while their brain activity is being recorded at every time point. So here in this example, you have fMRI activity being recorded while the subject is seeing a stream of words. And these paradigms have been used in language comprehension, but also in other domains like language production, conversation, and other modalities such as movie watching or even gameplay. Analyze the data from an experiment like this, you need a complex and rich approach that can actually model the content of a stimulus and relate it to the brain activity. And a great tool to do this is to use an encoding model, which is a framework that you can use to test specific hypotheses about brain representations, even if you don't have an initial experiment that has specific conditions that you can contrast. So at a high level, if you have naturalistic experiments with a complex stimulus, and you record brain activity related to this complex stimulus, what you need to do to build an encoding model is to build a vector representation of the type of information that you're interested in. For example, in this study where people were reading a chapter in the scanner, we constructed language-related features like syntactic and semantic information, again, embedded in a vector representation. And we also had higher level features like information related to the characters in the story, what they were doing, what they were feeling, etc. And what you do in an encoding model analysis is that you use one of these types of information and you build a predictive model that goes from the vector representation to the brain activity. Usually this predictive model is linear. And one of the reasons for doing that is that basically, if this was a very complex model, like a multi-layer perceptron, for example, then you could argue that the representation you're using is no longer the one that's only in the vector representation, but it becomes this like complex model with additional layers. And so typically people use a simple model at this stage. After you fit your model, you try to see which regions in the brain are well predicted, significantly predicted by your specific feature space that you're interested in. And so your feature space, your vector representation that you've constructed becomes your hypothesis that you're testing. Now, of course, it's hard to construct these feature spaces, and the ones I showed you now were constructed either by using some NLP tools that were available at the time or even hand design. But of course, there's an interesting thing you could do with models that are pervasive now that are very useful, and they are actually built to go from a stimulus to different layers of different vector representations at different layers, which are neural networks. And so you can ask, what if you replace your hand-designed features with a neural network that's designed to process language? And so back in 2014, we teamed up with Ashish Vaswani and Kevin Knight, who were working on language models that were built on neural networks. And back then, it was actually, so it wasn't like now, you couldn't just go online and download a large language model that's been trained on the entire internet. You had to, the models were smaller and it was harder to train them, and you had to train them every time you wanted to use them for a specific purpose. So here, our subjects were reading a Harry Potter chapter in the scanner. And so in order to train a model, what we decided to do was to find text that was similar to what they were reading. And luckily, there's a lot of fan fiction around Harry Potter online. So that's what was used in order to train these models. So we used a very simple model. This was a recurrent neural network. It was, it had three main components. So the first one is just the non-contextualized representation of a given word outside of context. The second one is a representation of the context of this word, so everything that appeared before this word. And from that context representation, what the language model does as a language model is to predict the word in that specific position before it knows what the word is. So it outputs a probability distribution in this position. And then once it sees the actual word Harry, it combines it with the previous context, generates a context for the next position, and so on. And so in some ways, in some simplified way, this network is reading these words word by word, just as a human subject who's sitting in a scanner would be reading them. And so we made a human subject read that same chapter in an MEG scanner, which allows it to have very high temporal resolution. And what we wanted to do is just use for each given word, we wanted to use the representation related to this word, so both the non-contextualized representation and the representation of the previous context to predict the activity that occurs when this word is being read. These are some of our results. And so here, it's just representing a single subject result, and the dark thick line is representing the result when we combine all subjects together, which gives us much more statistical power and a better accuracy. And our classification accuracy here, we don't need to get into it, it's just a measure of prediction performance. And what we're using in these two plots, we're using the context vector or just a single word vector in order to predict the activity at different time lags when a word is being read. So a word here was being read every 500 milliseconds. I mean, we don't have to restrict our analysis to these 500 milliseconds when the current word is being read. We can use the vectors related to this word to predict the activity before and after the word is being read. And so this is what we get. So for instance, for the context vector, we see that it predicts the brain activity very well before the word is read, which makes sense. This context vector is related to information that happened before the current word. But once the word is read and afterwards, this predictability just goes down and it's not able to predict the brain activity anymore, which makes sense because the brain is updating its representation of context. And then when we use the vector related to the current word, which happens here at time 0, we're able to predict the brain activity well before the word is on the screen, probably related to some correlations between successive words. And we're predicting activity very well when the word is on the screen, but also when the next word is on the screen, indicating that probably the brain is still processing the word that appears here at time 0 when the next word is being read. And so it was exciting to see how well you could predict MEG activity and how related the representations in the neural network are to the ones that we're capturing with brain activity. And after that, people this method started being adopted in the field. So people used it in order to study syntax using EEG and to study context representation using fMRI. And very quickly, this method started being adopted. And these are just some of the papers that appeared until 2021, and then so much more work that's happened since then. And one of the reasons why this has exploded is the availability now of these large language models that have been pre-trained and very generously shared by people online, which is a very important thing to have. And I hope that the open source community just keeps working on that, and that as these language models become bigger and more powerful, less of them are trapped behind paywalls. And so all of these studies together have obviously focused on different aspects of language processing, but they've all shown a very strong alignment between activations in a neural network language model and brain activity. And so this really makes this approach a very powerful one for studying language in the brain. One reason for that is that when you use these naturalistic experiments, you really make so many different things about language be present in the data, so you can study multiple things at once. And the NLP models that we have are very expressive, have very expressive embeddings for words and sequences of words. And by expressive, I mean like they contain a lot of different information about these words that might be relevant for the brain. But obviously, there are some things to be wary of. One criticism that we get a lot is that these models are not biologically plausible, they're not trained similarly to the brain, and they cannot be a model for the brain. And I think this is an easy criticism to go around, because we never say that actually when we find this strong alignment, we don't really think of the neural network as an actual mechanistic explanation for what the brain is actually doing. We're talking about an alignment that's more at the representational level, and more the content, the informational content of these layers. Another problem is that these embeddings we extract from the model are not interpretable themselves. They have different information. They have all sorts of correlated information about language. And it's not just the embedding, the naturalistic data also is very correlated, has a lot of correlations because of natural stimulus correlations like syntax and semantics being correlated. But luckily, there are things we can do. So there's an approach or a set of approaches that people have done in the field. And my student, Maria Toneva, called this particular type of approach computational controls. And in the few remaining minutes, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about how to do these computational controls in order to isolate a specific type of information. And doing that, just reveal that the presence of that type of information in the brain. And then in the remaining time, I'll also tell you about another approach you could do with using large language models by actually modifying them in order to make them match the brain more and trying to see what that tells you about the brain and about the models. So here's an example of using computational control. We were interested here in studying where in the brain the end product of composition is represented. So what we mean by that is the new meaning that gets created when you combine words together. So if you read this sentence, the little boy finally finished his pasta, you understand it to mean that the boy finished eating his pasta, even though the word eating is not present in the sentence. And one proposal for where this type of meaning is represented was that it was in the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. Now, this is a difficult question to study because what you need here in order to know where this extra word is this extra meaning is represented is you need an operational definition for this extra word. You need an object that you can use in order to model this superword meaning, which is what we mean by superword meaning is this new meaning that gets created. And in this paper, we tried to operationalize this. So if you think back of the context vector I told you about earlier, we're using here a different language model, but it's just the same idea. If you think of the context vector here, the context embedding, it's actually a function of multiple different words that went into creating that vector. It was done iteratively, but it's actually just a complex function of the single word embedding of all of these words. And so what we need to do is we need to remove from this context vector the information that's related to these words individually and just keep the new information that's not really in any of those words. And one way to do that, and I'm sorry here, the conversion kind of changed the equation a little bit, but it just pulled down a little bit. But what we need to do is first we estimate a linear function, this function g, which tries to predict the context vector linearly only from all of the words that went into constructing this context vector. And then what we do is we basically take the residuals of this prediction. So we take the original context vector and our linear prediction of that context vector from all the individual words, and we take the residuals. So what this gives us is all the information that is not in the span of the individual words on that one. So everything that's new, that's not in the individual words. And so this is our operational definition for the supraword meaning. And we see that when we use this to predict brain activity, before we do this disentanglement, the context vector is predicting so many different ROIs in the brain. But when we do the disentanglement and we only keep the supraword meaning, we see that the anterior temporal lobe and the posterior temporal lobe are both predicted by the supraword meaning. And so this is our hypothesis, is that these are the regions that are maintaining this new meaning that arises when we combine words together. And we see that this ATL and PTL result actually generalizes not only across subject, but also across experiments with a different paradigm, different modalities, and different scanners, etc. So in this case, using data from the Courtois Neuromod project, where people are watching a movie, the movie Hidden Figures, and we take all of the speech in the movie and we convert it to text and we do the same analysis. We find that we also, again, the ATL and the PTL are the ones that are capturing this superwave. So this was our example of using computational controls to study something specific in language processing, but it's actually different tools that also can be characterized as computational controls have been also used to study language processing in this way. Most recently using language models in order to show predictive coding in the human brain during language comprehension, but also looking, for instance, at syntactic representation and how it's different from semantic representation. All right. And so in the last few minutes, I want to tell you about how to use this entire paradigm in order to look maybe not necessarily at how there's similarity between the brain and a language model, but also to focus on the dissimilarities. And so here in this work, we focus on what is different between language models and brain activity. And so earlier in all of the results that the people use, they typically just look at the average activity across all the words in a specific region in the brain or at a specific time lag. But what we did here is actually look at the prediction performance per word instead of per region. And because we're using MEG here, we can actually have that data per word. And what we can do is we can take our entire stimulus and we can basically look at how well is each word predicted by this approach. And here each word in these example sentences are colored by how accurate they were predicted. So here, when we look at most divergent words, what we mean by that is that these words were not well predicted by this approach, meaning that the representation for those words in the neural network is actually different from the one in the brain. And the ones that are more in the more black color are the ones that are least divergent, meaning that these words were actually best predicted by the model in terms of how accurate the MEG data was predicted. And so if you take your entire text and color it in this way, it's a little bit hard to just come up with the general principles of what differentiates these two types of words. So what we do here is we just look at individual sentences in our paradigm, and we just group them in terms of most divergent and least divergent sentences. And in order to come up with a systematic way to differentiate between them, we use basically an automated way where we ask the language model to come up with a hypothesis about what differentiates these two groups of sentences. And after we generate these hypotheses, we test them both with a permutation test, but also we have people actually test these hypotheses and make sure that they do characterize these sentences that we come up with. These are the top hypotheses that characterize these most divergent sentences. So these are what the method thinks characterizes the sentences that are most hardest to predict in the brain, or for which there's most dissimilarity between the representation in the brain and representation in a language model. And just for the interest of time, we can focus on some of these hypotheses, which pinpoint to actually a difference between how the brain represents emotional information in sentences and how the language model represents emotional information in sentences. And since we would assume that the human is a better processor of language, the hypothesis here is that the language model does not process emotional information very well. But luckily, there is a way to teach a language model to process information, so you could do a fine-tuning task with an emotional data set. And then we can see, does actually improving this language model with an emotional data set, does teaching it to do more emotion better, lead to better alignment with the brain. And we do see that actually, once we do this fine-tuning on emotional tasks, we get a very strong improvement in our ability to predict brain activity over time. And we even see this improvement as being even more pronounced for emotional words in the stories. So that does validate that actually the thing that was different between the human and the language model is just this ability to process emotion. And in conclusion, I've told you how these large language models enable the analysis of these naturalistic language experiments, and how precise you can use computational control to isolate a specific type of information and relate it to brain activity. And I very quickly told you about how these language models can be adapted to be better brain models. I didn't have the time to tell you about the following, but I can tell you at another occasion, but how we can use this method to learn more about the brain, but even maybe create better language models. Thank you.